Tonight, we're here, though, to hear from Ambassador Dennis Ross, so let me introduce him to you now. He is a William Davidson Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He is also Distinguished Professor in the practice of diplomacy at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. For more than 12 years, Ambassador Ross played a leading role in shaping United States involvement in the Middle East peace process, dealing directly with the parties in negotiations and having a position in several presidential administrations. He has worked in the State Department under President George H.W. Bush. He was President Bill Clinton's Middle East peace envoy, and we'll talk about specifically what he did in each of these cases, and Ambassador Ross served as a special assistant to President Obama. In addition, during the Reagan administration, he served as Director of Near East and South Asian Affairs on the National Security Council staff. He has written several important books on the peace process, and just a few weeks ago published Doomed to Succeed, the U.S.-Israel Relationship from Truman to Obama. He has autographed copies outside. It's a great Hanukkah gift. It's a great read. It's a history lesson in one book in a way that is just extraordinary from a man who was present for a great deal of it and researched in a way that you'll find absolutely riveting. So I encourage you, if you've not picked up a copy, to pick one up on the way out. Ambassador Ross was awarded the Presidential Medal for Distinguished Federal Civilian Service by President Clinton, and Secretaries Baker and Albright presented him with the State Department's highest award. We are delighted to have him with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Dennis Ross. You've been busy. You've been traveling quite a bit, haven't you?
Well, you know, when you write a book, you want to get out there and talk about it, and you write books because you want them to be read. So one way to make sure they get read is people hear about them.
Well,
so
they certainly.
That's what I'm doing.
Where have you been in the last week? I'm just curious.
I have this amazing travel log. Where have I been in the last week? On Sunday, I was in Winnipeg. Monday, I flew back to teach my class in Washington. Tuesday, I flew to San Francisco. Wednesday, I flew to Tucson. Thursday, I flew here. So this has actually been a very easy week.
Ambassador, there are 4 areas that I hope to explore with you this evening. One of them is the focus of your book, the presidents and their relationship to Israel. I also want to explore with you some conclusions you reach, which I think are quite insightful. The third area I hope we'll have a chance to speak about is recent events, particularly overseas. And then finally, if there's time, and I hope there will be, what it's like to be a diplomat, your life as a negotiator in a way that most people don't get a chance to hear about. Before looking at the presidents, though, I want to ask you about 2 pieces of legislation which impacted the creation of the Jewish state, and ask you just in a line or two to share with all of us, remind all of us what they were. The first was the Balfour Declaration in 1917, and the other was the British White Paper, 1938 or 39.
1939. All right, so there's the Balfour Declaration was something that emerged largely because of Chaim Weizmann's efforts in Britain. He was convinced that if you could gain British support for Zionism, the Zionist movement, and support for at least the concept of a Jewish state, that this would cross an important political threshold, policy and political. It would create, particularly because the British were seen as, even though this is during World War I, were seen as the strongest global power at the time. It would invest the Zionist movement with much more credibility than it would have otherwise. And on November 2nd, 1917, it was adopted. Now, it didn't call for a Jewish state, it actually called for a Jewish Commonwealth in Palestine. And it is interesting that you have this kind of dichotomy between those on the outside of Palestine, maybe people like Weizmann, and those on the inside who had made Aliyah and were building it from the ground up. David Ben-Gurion, when it was adopted, said, this is nice, but it won't produce a state. Only we will produce a state. So Weizmann saw it as creating a kind of political legitimacy for Jewish statehood, and in many respects it did. Now the interesting thing about the White Paper is adopted in 1939, and the White Paper is adopted by the British on the eve of World War II, when suddenly they're very sensitive to the need for Arab support, access to what will be Arab oil, access to the Middle East, which is seen as a kind of strategic crossroads. And so they reverse the Balfour Declaration. They say that there'll be Jewish immigration that is allowed for 5 more years, 15,000 a year for 5 years, meaning Jewish immigration and the Jewish population will be capped at that point, and Jews won't be allowed to immigrate after that. And it is literally a reversal of the White Paper. It's one of the things, by the way, Churchill looks at Chamberlain before Munich and after Munich as, in a sense, someone who doesn't understand the realities of power. He also looks at the White Paper as another sign of appeasement. He's one of the few British leaders, although he's in the opposition at that point, who is opposed to the White Paper.
So is it safe to say that at precisely the time when Jews needed a place to go to, 1939, the British did the one thing that was in some ways the worst for the Jews, capping the number of Jews who could go to Israel or Palestine to 15,000 people?
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, look, I mean, we'll talk about current events later, but it's very hard to be Jewish, know the history of what happened to Jews who could not escape Nazi Germany, and refugees who had no place to go. So when I see people today, saying, well, we're not going to allow Syrian refugees to come, I find it at a time when close to 13 million people have been displaced. They're not displaced because they want to be displaced. The 9 million who are living in Syria who have been displaced, another 4 million are refugees. The 9 million who have been displaced are living in conditions that you can't even imagine.
Let's come to that a little bit later. I want to go through, there are 12 presidents. Ambassador Ross's book chronicles each president and his relationship with Israel individually. There's a chapter on every single one of the presidents. There are 12 presidents, from Truman to Obama, and if we spend 5 minutes on each of them, you all have to go home then. And there's so many things that we want to talk about, so I'll try to ask you a few what I hope are appropriate questions about each of them, with perhaps a little more focus on the presidents with whom you work directly and more currently. So let's start off with President Truman. He acknowledges Israel's statehood. Beyond that, does he do much?
He is remembered as, and among Israelis as well, as someone who was a profoundly, emotionally committed president to the state of Israel. And it took courage for him to override the opposition of his entire national security establishment, including all the people who were referred to as the wise men, the people who shaped Cold War institutions. So it did take courage for him to override them and recognize the state, because they uniformly did not want recognition of the state of Israel. And for reasons we can get into that were based not only just on a sense that our interests would lie with the Arabs, but based on a set of assumptions that were completely wrong. I'll just note one thing and I'll come back to Truman. The day before the partition plan is adopted by the UN, it's November 29, 1947, the day before that, the CIA issues a special intelligence finding, a national intelligence estimate, that comes out and says that a Jewish state will not be viable, that the Jews could not last more than 2 years, and the only way that they could survive is if we put hundreds of thousands of American military forces in there to sustain them. Now, I can tell you, as someone who was involved with policymaking for a long time, you want to come up with an option that you are sure will be dead on arrival, all you got to do is say, well, it'll take hundreds of thousands of American forces to be able to do this. So it is not a coincidence that the day before the partition plan is being voted at the UN, the CIA comes out with this. George Kennan and Lloyd Henderson write similar memos in January of 1948. So there's a uniform opposition to the creation of the state out of fears that the Jews can't be viable as a state, but most importantly because we fear the Arab reaction. Truman does something very important by recognizing, but he also imposes an arms embargo.
Right, at the time when Israel ends up going to war.
Right.
So he doesn't send any arms in support of Israel.
At no point does he provide arms to Israel during the life of his administration. One thing that's noteworthy, when the Korean War begins, he actually goes to the Israelis and asks them to provide a brigade.
Do they?
No, because in fact, they can't really afford it since they're surrounded by enemies and they're not getting any arms from us. And they say, well, we might be able to provide some. Ben-Gurion actually takes it to his cabinet and raises the idea of making some contribution, but he says, well, maybe you could provide us some arms in the process. But he doesn't provide arms, and I'll tell you something else. He doesn't provide any assistance, economic assistance, for 7 months after Israel declares itself a state. In the end, he does provide loans, and he does provide some grant assistance. It's not dramatic. And at the time, Israel's absorbing a population larger than the one that existed at the beginning of the war, meaning they had 600,000. By 1951, they have double that because they've had to absorb the Jews from the Arab world who are forced to leave with no possessions. This is a fairly wealthy community in different countries like Egypt and Iraq. They're forced to leave with nothing.
Let's go to Eisenhower. You say that Eisenhower, I believe you wrote that Eisenhower sees the Middle East as the place of the United States and the Soviets. That's sort of the epicenter of their struggle for power. So the irony here is that the Soviets armed Nasser, I think, to the teeth.
Right.
And his status must have been elevated dramatically.
It was.
In the Arab world, so that the one area that Eisenhower cared most about was the area he ends up failing in. Is that a fair assumption?
It's yes, absolutely. He and Dulles are convinced that the real focal point of competition between ourselves and the Soviets is the Middle East. And because of that, and because he feels that Truman was governed by political concerns only. I mean, here's the irony. As we just said, Truman actually recognizes Israel, but he doesn't do a lot for Israel in tangible terms. But Eisenhower's perception of Truman is that Truman is, in a sense, owned by the Jews. I mean, John Foster Dulles, you'll see when you read the book, as you all will. When you read the Eisenhower, when you read the Eisenhower chapter, there's one place where John Foster Dulles says to Charles Luce, George Marshall, Secretary of State, and James Forrestal tried to have a policy not run by the Jews, and they couldn't. We will. And so they have a perception. You can get that. It's okay. They have this perception that somehow it was only political factors, and here is a region that is a focal point of competition with the Soviets. So they're going to come in and they're going to change our policy so it is basically based on what are our real interests, which is to be with the Arabs. One of the great ironies is, of course, when Kennedy comes in, Kennedy says, boy, this was a colossal failure. In a sense, here's an administration that does everything the, quote, Arabists want to be done, and our position in the Middle East is dramatically worse at the end of the Eisenhower administration than it was going in.
So let's turn to Kennedy for a moment. You characterized Truman's, in one word, you used the word struggle to characterize Truman's perspective on that president, on the relationship. For Kennedy, I think you used the word balance.
Yes.
What happened during the years when Kennedy was president vis-a-vis Israel?
Well, the most important thing that Kennedy does is that he's the first to provide arms to Israel. He provides a defensive weapon system, Hawk anti-aircraft missiles. Now, interestingly enough, it triggers a profound debate within his administration. His Secretary of State, Dean Russ, says this will set a terrible precedent.
Right.
It'll do grave damage to us with the Arabs. And as I like to say, and as I point out in the book, as luck would have it, the day the news of this arms sale leaks out, he's meeting the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, who at the time was actually the putative leader of Saudi Arabia, who doesn't even raise the issue because he's focused on the fact that there's been a Nasserist-backed coup in Yemen, and he sees that as a fundamental threat to Saudi Arabia because here is Nasser trying to establish a foothold in the Arabian Peninsula. So Rusk, who is convinced that our relations with the Arabs may be doomed because of this arms sale, suddenly when he meets a leading Arab figure, when this has emerged, discovers that he's not interested in this arms to Israel because he doesn't see those as a threat.
But Kennedy does see Israel as a special country, right? Not as just another place to support. There's a certain emotional attachment.
I don't know if there's an emotional attachment. I don't know if there's that. It is interesting, he has around him a guy named Mike Feldman, who is a domestic political counselor, but he gives him a responsibility not only to be a liaison to the Jewish community, but also to Israel. He knows Feldman tells him he has a special attachment to Israel, and does he really want him working on that? And he says, yes, I do. I would think less of you if you didn't have that. Kennedy is the first to use language where he refers to Israel as a special country and we have a special relationship. He is the first to do that. But he also, I did use the term balance because he reaches out to Nasser. He thinks we can have relations with both. By the way, he proves that you can. It is interesting, when Faisal comes 1 week after seeing Rusk and raising the issue of what is the Nasser's back coup in Yemen, what in fact Faisal raises with Kennedy isn't Israel at all, isn't the arms at all. He raises our outreach to Egypt, our economic assistance to Egypt, which he says is freeing up Nasser to threaten all of America's friends, to change the regional balance of power in the area. And basically, he seeks from us more assurances and more arms. I say throughout the book, in every chapter, you will hear echoes that reverberate over time.
Yeah.
If you substitute the word Iran for Egypt, you get the same conversation we're having with the Saudis today.
After Kennedy's assassinated, President Johnson takes over, and of course he's obsessed with the Vietnam War. That becomes the focus. It's number of troops. I think at some point there are 500,000 American troops.
Right.
Is that the number in Vietnam? Something like that. And then in 1967, Israel's faced with a war, and there's the Six-Day War. Did they reach out to the United States at that point? Did President Johnson do anything to be helpful to Israel at that point?
It's quite remarkable because a couple points are worth noting. One, Johnson actually does have a deep emotional commitment to Israel, and it grows out of his belief in the Bible. I mean, we were talking before we came down here about evangelicals. Well, he's not evangelical, but he does have a deeply rooted view of Israel, and it comes from the way he reads the Bible and he sees the Jews as a people of the book and so forth. So he has a deeply emotional attachment to Israel, and yet when the 2 weeks prior to the Six-Day War, when Nasser kicks the UN out of the Sinai Desert, when 6 Egyptian divisions go to the Israeli border, when the Israelis come to us and say, well, look, there were commitments made to us at the time we withdrew, when Eisenhower forces Israel out to withdraw from the Sinai Desert, even threatening sanctions, but in return, he does make a couple of commitments to Israel. And that is that, first, if the Straits of Tiran are ever blockaded, that Israel would have a right of self-defense.
Right.
And that we would do everything we could to ensure freedom of navigation through there. Nasser comes in, blockades the strait, declares a blockade, and the Israelis come to us and say, no, not quite.
And we don't do it, and they do not. We do nothing.
Well, and first of all, Johnson doesn't know about the commitments. He actually sends Walt Rostow to Gettysburg to see Eisenhower to say, did you make such a commitment?
Was Dean Rusk still the Secretary of State?
He is.
And he is not sympathetic to Israel ever.
I think it's fair to say he was able to restrain his enthusiasm for Israel.
Yes.
But Johnson, there's this amazing exchange that Johnson has with Abba Eban, because Abba Eban is the foreign minister he's sent over here to see the president. Eshkol is under enormous pressure to respond to the fact that the Egyptians have now 6 divisions on their border, and Eshkol doesn't want to do this in opposition to the United States. And so in the first instance, he wants to avoid war. In the second instance, he's asking the U.S. to fulfill these obligations. If they do, in a sense, he's sending a message, we're prepared to avoid war. And Johnson says to Eban, you know, you'll only be alone if you act alone. And then he says, of course, he's going to create a regatta to try to, an international flotilla to try to open this. But without telling him this, we have no takers.
Right.
It's also to give you a sense of how different things were. Because of the Vietnam War, there's no congressional support for us to do anything at this time. So Johnson couldn't get a resolution through the Congress. And he's saying to Eban, look, he has to work through the UN, he has to work through the Congress. Arthur Goldberg tells Eban after he sees Johnson, basically, you owe it to your prime minister and you owe it to your country. You can't count on the president to do anything. Mm-hmm. He's that bold and bald in telling him that. And Johnson, in the meeting with Eban, says, look, I'm not a feeble mouse. I'll do what I can, but he really feels his hands are tied, both because we are completely consumed in Vietnam. One of the things I note is that the person who was Kennedy's expert on the Middle East was a guy named Robert Comer. Johnson develops a relationship with him when he's vice president. He goes to the Middle East, Comer goes with him, and he trusts him, and he takes Comer, who knew nothing about Asia or Vietnam, and he puts him in charge of the pacification program in Vietnam, which tells you a couple things. One, Johnson operates based on trust, right. But two, what mattered to him was Vietnam. It didn't matter to him that he was taking the leading expert he had on the Middle East out of that job and putting him into something where he knew nothing about it, because his preoccupation was Vietnam. And the truth is, we were pretty much surprised by everything because our entire attention was riveted on Vietnam.
So in 68, when Nixon, 68?
He's elected in 68, becomes president in 69.
In 69, right. And he's also president during what is also a great Russian support. Dobrynin was the secretary?
Yeah, Dobrynin is the ambassador to
the ambassador to the
Russia.
United States. So there's great Soviet buildup in the Middle East. And then there's the 73 war where Israel's attacked on Yom Kippur, comes close to losing that war, as I recall. And you have a quote of Nixon's, something like, send anything that can fly to get arms to Israel. I'm paraphrasing.
No, it's true. He does say that, but he says it on the 8th day of the war. Nixon is I was going to say he was a complicated figure. That's really a profound thing to say, isn't it?
That's very diplomatic,
yeah.
Ambassador.
Okay, I'll be less diplomatic. Nixon doesn't allow Kissinger work on the Middle East for the first couple years of the administration because he's Jewish, and he says it. Nixon wants to reach out to the Arabs. Nixon believes that that the U.S. lost the '67 war, that the '67 war was a defeat for the United States. He believes it because he thinks it gives the Soviets greater access in the region. Now, it doesn't give them greater access than they already had, at least to Egypt and Syria, but this is the way Nixon reads it. And so he wants to establish ties to Egypt and Syria, and he feels that Kissinger's Jewishness makes that impossible. What is, of course, ironic is, after the '73 war, it is Kissinger who does the disengagement agreements with Egypt and Syria. It is Kissinger who establishes diplomatic relations with both. For the first 7 days of the war, Nixon withholds, basically, the administration withholds arms to Israel. And the reason is because Nixon feels if there's a stalemate, you'll be able to produce diplomacy. If Israel wins decisively, you won't have diplomacy. He doesn't want the Arabs to win decisively, but he wants a stalemate because he believes a stalemate will allow you to launch a diplomatic effort. And there's an expectation that the Israelis will win, so you don't want them to win too dramatically. So we withhold weapons for the first 7 days. Now, you have to understand the first couple of days of the war, the Israelis are not only surprised, they're also surprised by the tactics. In the first week of the war, Israel loses or has out of commission 800 tanks. Right. A quarter of the Air Force is grounded. At one point, because we're not resupplying them for the first 7 days, the Israelis have begun to turn the tide on the Golan Heights, but they have to, in a sense, slow down the offensive because they're running short of ammunition. The expectation is we're going to produce a ceasefire resolution on October 13th. The war starts on October 6th. On October 13th, we believe we're going to have a Security Council resolution that will produce a ceasefire resolution that can be the basis of diplomacy. And we are led to believe by Dobrynin to Kissinger that Sadat will accept it. And the Soviets will go along with it. Well, it turns out Sadat won't accept it. Sadat is doing better than he thought he was going to do, and basically these terms aren't good enough. He wants the Israelis to withdraw to the June 467 lines if he's going to accept ceasefire resolution. So when it turns out that there isn't going to be a ceasefire resolution, and the Soviets at this point are significantly resupplying Egypt and Syria, at that point, for Nixon and Kissinger, and particularly Nixon, you can't afford to have Soviet arms defeat American arms. And that's when Nixon says, anything that can fly, you get it to Israel. And so we do. We provide a mammoth resupply of Israel, which Israel had, at this point, had already turned the tide on the Golan Heights, and it had launched a counteroffensive in the Sinai, but the resupply is so dramatic that it makes it possible for Israel to sustain the offensive that it's carrying out.
Doesn't Nixon, I don't know if you've mentioned this in the book, but doesn't Nixon put the United States on red alert for one of the few times in the country's history?
I do mention, he raises it to you have 5 levels of readiness. The highest level of readiness is you're going to war. He raised it to basically the second level. And he did it because Brezhnev was threatening to intervene. He sent a message in which he said, we should go in together, but if we weren't prepared to act, that they would go unilaterally. And we picked up intelligence that suggested the Soviets were moving ships with nuclear weapons towards the region. And that's when Nixon raises the alert level.
Since President Ford was only president for a short time, I will only get a sense of you from you that he's essentially not interested, or he's prepared to just let whatever happened to Israel happen to Israel.
Basically, he lets Kissinger run the policy. Kissinger, this is a period when we do have something called the reassessment. Kissinger is trying to produce a second disengagement in Egypt, in the Sinai. He becomes frustrated with Rabin and Rabin's government. He feels they're not prepared to give enough. He actually says, you're losing the forest for the trees, you're focused on meters when you should be seeing the big picture. And the Israelis don't go along at one point, and he basically announces a reassessment of our relations. In the end, however, after a couple of months, he does a second disengagement agreement, and he makes a series of promises to Israel. By the way, there's a letter that he drafts, but it's a Ford-Rabin letter, which I can tell you, years later, we observed it. There were things we did that were governed by that letter. Almost every administration will respect a presidential letter. I mean, it does get significant because up in the Obama administration, there is a Bush letter that is not respected. But we can get to that.
There's so many questions to ask you about President Carter, but let me frame it this way. The president who is the architect of the Camp David Accords, of this incredible peace agreement in 1978.
September 78, yeah.
Right, with Begin and Sadat.
Right.
Is the same president who, after his presidency, writes a book called about Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid, and says that the greatest obstacle to peace essentially is Israel in the Middle East. In a nutshell, what happened to President Carter?
I'll tell you, in a nutshell, what happens to Carter. I would describe it in 2 ways. First, even though he is the hero of Camp David, and I say that when you read the Carter chapter, you'll see that, but he basically looks at Israel, both before and after, as being the impediment to what are his larger aspirations for peace in the region. He believes peace in the Middle East actually will be transformative internationally, not just in the Middle East. I mean, I use irony as a watchword of that chapter because he is completely committed to pursuing peace and sees this as transformative in the Middle East, and yet he is done in by a Middle Eastern issue, meaning the fall of the Shah and then the Iran-Iraq war and the hostages. And all of his time and attention on the Arab-Israeli issue didn't affect this and couldn't have affected it one iota. And in no small measure, because he's completely distracted by the one, he doesn't pay attention to what's going on in Iran at a time when we might have been able to do something differently. So one thing is he's always riveted on the peace issue, and he sees Israel as the impediment. He has a terrible meeting with Yitzhak Rabin. I describe it in the first part of the chapter, which in some ways may have actually contributed to Begin's victory in May of 1977. Afterwards, he continues to view the Israelis. I think part of this is he blamed the Israelis for his loss, the election loss. I describe this in the book. In March of 1980, Ted Kennedy was running against him in the primaries. In the first few primaries, Carter won, and he was 20 points ahead in the polls in New York. And then there was a Security Council resolution that we didn't veto, and it referred to Jerusalem and building in Jerusalem. And it was a mistake. Carter had intended that we would veto if the word Jerusalem was in there, and somehow it didn't happen. So he says this is a mistake, but Kennedy immediately leaps on it, and he goes from being 20 points down in the New York primary poll. He wins the New York primary, and he ends up staying in for a long time, and Carter believes that somehow this made him much more vulnerable and ultimately contributed to his defeat.
So he turns against Israel for that?
I think that's a factor. The other factor is, and I have this, I found, again, one of the great things when you go back through the diaries of these presidents, they say things that are unbelievably revealing. He, at one point, describes the conversation that he's having with Sadat, and he talks about how he relates to the Arabs, he relates to them because, he understands what occupation means because he comes from an area that was also occupied. And, he says that. You have to read the book to actually see that, but when you do read the book, as you will, you'll see, that's part of it. And I also think there's something else. I think that he feels a kind of guilt over having not been active in the civil rights movement. And he links that sense of guilt. He identifies with those who he sees as being weak and oppressed internationally, and he sees the Israelis as an occupying power. And that's why you end up with a book called Peace, Not Apartheid.
So we go from him to President Reagan,
right,
who you write of his emotional attachment to Israel.
Right.
Even though he wasn't always supportive of Israel and even punished Israel,
right,
as I recall, at some point by not sending them aircraft. Where did President Reagan's emotional attachment to Israel come from?
He did training films during World War II. And in that role, he was among the first to see the films of the liberation of the death camps. He tells George Shultz, when he's president, that he still has these films. He tells George Shultz, when George Shultz was the Secretary of State, that he has them and he kept them because what he saw was so awful, he thought it would never be believed unless you could show it. And it creates for him a moral attachment to Israel.
Ambassador Ross, didn't Eisenhower, when he went into, when they went into the concentration camps, insist that it be filmed because people would not believe it unless they could actually see it?
He did. What's interesting is for Reagan, it becomes a kind of moral imperative to have this obligation towards Israel. For Eisenhower, he wants it shown. He's the one who has film crews go in.
Right.
Because he's still the commanding general at this point. And he wants the world to see, but he wants the world to see this is why we had to fight this war. But he doesn't create a connection between that and the Jewish people and the idea of a state for the Jewish people. And Reagan does.
You then served in his successor's administration, George H.W. Bush. You describe yourself as a lifelong Democrat,
right,
working in President Bush's administration because of your respect for
right,
President Bush. Let me ask you this question then. Having worked in his administration, the first President Bush,
right,
when you left your work, did you end up with greater or diminished respect for President Bush vis-a-vis Israel?
I say in the book, there's a lot of similarities between the Bush 41 administration and the Obama administration, where, in some very concrete, practical terms, very important things are done for Israel. But there's also a public discord. And Bush is someone who does not have a special attachment to Israel, but he does believe if you make a commitment, you have to fulfill your commitments. So where we had commitments, he would fulfill those, but he had no difficulty being critical of the Israelis on the issues that he felt they should be criticized for, which is much like President Obama.
Okay, so you continued your work and you then become, under President Clinton, you are the lead negotiator as the envoy. You are the point person for the administration when it comes to making peace in the Middle East. The state of affairs that Clinton inherits, you write about.
Right.
The Soviets are in disarray. There's no Soviet Union anymore. It's a pretty good situation. You are the one. It's better that you should describe. You were very close with President Clinton. Describe what you call this great drive for peace that he has.
Look, in President Clinton, there's a perception of President Clinton that President Clinton was sort of motivated by wanting a legacy. That's why he made such a commitment on this. And I'm not saying every president wants a legacy, but that's not what drove him on this issue. In March of 1993, in his first meeting with Yitzhak Rabin, he said to Rabin, "You take risks for peace, and my job is to minimize those risks." When Rabin was assassinated, it was devastating to all of us who were involved in this, but it was no less devastating to President Clinton than it was to me. And President Clinton felt in the aftermath of that, he had a burden. He had a debt that he had to pay. And for him, he now had a mission. He had to fulfill the Rabin legacy. And that's why he was so committed.
And you actually met with Rabin just 3 days before he was assassinated.
I did.
You had a private meeting with him.
I did.
What was the focus of that meeting?
I had just, look, I was our negotiator. I would see him all the time. And I had just been up to see Hafiz al-Assad. So I was briefing him on what that discussion was. And then I was going to go see Arafat after I saw him. And on the Syrian track, basically, we were stuck because Assad had retreated on a commitment that he had made to have the military, the major generals on each side meet. And so Rabin's position was not to do anything until Assad had fulfilled that commitment. And I had basically seen Assad to say, this was a process that had to be governed by fulfillment of commitments. Since he had retreated, we weren't going to do anything more until he did something on that. And so Rabin was happy to hear that that's what I'd done. Then I said, I'm going to go see Arafat. What do you want me to do with him? Now, this is 5.5 weeks after the interim agreement has been signed. This is it's going to bring the Palestinian Authority to the West Bank. And Rabin raised with me, he said, look, we're seeing more and more Hamas developments in Gaza. You need to raise that with Arafat. And I said to him, okay, I will, but I know Arafat, and you know Arafat. If I go in and say, you got to do something about the Hamas infrastructure, he'll say, okay, and it will mean nothing. I mean, I can't hold him accountable unless I can be very specific in terms of what he has to do, and then when I go back, I can find out whether or not he's done it. And so Rabin thought about it for a second, then he said, let us do it first. And then we got into a regional discussion of what was going on. And I wrote about this. The LA Times asked me to write on the 20th anniversary of the assassination. His last words to me, I said, they still haunt me. He said, Dennis, expect anything. Wow. And the one thing I couldn't expect, the one thing I still can't really fathom is that he was assassinated.
Wow. I was just thinking what your Outlook calendar must look like. On my Outlook calendar, it could say, lunch with the Cohens, dinner with the Smiths. Yours says Assad, Arafat, Rabin. Yes, one last question about President Clinton. You feel he was the greatest ally of Israel of any president of the United States?
I do, because he's the only one in every administration, from Truman to Obama, there has been a constituency that looked at Israel through a lens of it being a problem. And because it was a problem, there was a kind of competitive instinct, almost at times a combative instinct. The only administration in which that constituency that saw Israel as a problem existed but had no influence was Clinton's. And it wasn't just because I was the negotiator. That may have had something to do with it, but it was also, Clinton believed that we were Israel's only friend in the world, the only reliable friend in the world. And we could have differences, but if we magnified those differences and we put them in public and we created the image of a wedge between the United States and Israel, that would encourage Israel's enemies and it would weaken Israel's deterrent. So as a matter of conviction, he didn't believe that we should have a public dissonance with Israel.
Right.
And, you know, I mean, there were some of his advisors who felt that was the case from time to time, but it became clear very quickly he wouldn't counsel us. He just wouldn't do it.
President George W. Bush, the irony of his presidency strikes me as, here's a man who rose to the presidency speaking almost exclusively about domestic affairs, and he ends up spending much of his presidency, because of 9/11, focused on international affairs. I read a very thoughtful piece by Leon Wieselt here, formerly of New Republic, now I think The Atlantic, where he writes about how presidents rarely get to set their own agenda. Things happen in the world, and all of a sudden, that's what ends up being their agenda.
Right.
How did 9/11 affect President Bush's relationship with Israel?
Bush comes in, and he really has no emotional attachment to Israel. He's thinking politically when he comes in. His father got 11% of the Jewish vote, and he wants to, and he's the guy who lost the popular vote.
Right.
He won by a hanging chad, right? So he's thinking about where can he add to his 49.9%, and he's looking at different constituencies, and he thinks, he looks at the Jews through kind of a political lens and thinks that he can attract something more there. But it's a politically motivated instinct. And ironically, when we start having some problems with the Arabs, he suddenly has his father come in. He does a call to, he has his father call the Crown Prince Abdullah of Saudi Arabia. He's sitting next to him, so his father will vouch for him as being okay. We do a letter. We literally do a letter, a secret letter to the Saudis when they, say they're unhappy with us. And suddenly Bush promises not only statehood, before anybody knows it, he promises support for Palestinian statehood, and he also promises support for self-determination for the Palestinians, which is a formula we had never used, because self-determination for the Palestinians has to be somewhat tempered. What does it do to self-determination for Jordan? What does it do to self-determination for Israel?
Although he's quite popular in Israel, is he not?
Well, he is, because 9/11 transforms him. And although his first call to Sharon after 9/11, he's pressing Sharon to have Sharon have his foreign minister, Shimon Peres, see Arafat. Now, he has declared a war on terror. Bush has declared a war on terror, and he's pressing at a time when there's bombs going off in Israel for the Israelis to be meeting with Arafat, who's actually responsible for those bombs. Now, the reason is because of that constituency that I described that had the view that Israel was the problem. I mean, there was a sense after 9/11 in the intelligence community and the State Department that the reason 9/11 took place was because of the Palestinians, because of Israel. We were too close to Israel. We weren't doing enough on the Palestinians. And in a sense, Bush goes along with that to begin with. But because of 9/11, the more he thinks about it, he says, well, wait, there can't be one set of rules for us and a different set of rules for the Israelis and those who are threatened by terror. So he changes, and he does. He genuinely evolves. By the end of his presidency, I mean, he does have an emotional commitment to Israel. He gives a speech in May of 2008 to the Knesset. He goes to Israel, gives a speech to the Knesset, and he says, you may be 7 million people, but you're actually 307 million people because you have us with you. And this is something that he has evolved over the course of his presidency. So what may have been a political motivation to begin with is transformed over time.
When President Obama is elected, you soon get a call from the administration, and you get a couple of job offers. You choose one, and then you write about how, in retrospect, you wish you had chose the other, and then President Obama meets with you
Right.
to try to convince you of something. If you don't mind.
Yeah, I mean, so, look, I have a choice. Hillary Clinton asked me to go with her, and obviously I knew her well because during the President Clinton's administration, frequently when I would be briefing the president, which I was doing pretty often, she would sit in on those briefings. And I also, when she was elected a senator in the year 2000, before the end of the Clinton administration, but in November 2000, Leah Rabin died, and she asked if I would go with her to the funeral. I expected there'd be she'd have a big retinue of people around her, and she had me and two others. And so I knew her. She wanted me to go with her. I wanted responsibility for the Iran issue. And I was also offered then a position. They were carving out a position for me at the White House. But I chose to go with her. And I went with her because I thought, that the action would be with her. I thought the conceptualization of policy and the implementation would be there. I thought the president would be consumed by the financial meltdown, and I was wrong. And I wasn't wrong that she had the capability. I was wrong that the decision-making locus would be on these issues in the State Department. They were not. Everything was run out of the White House. President Bush might have referred to himself as being the decider, but it turned out in the Obama administration there was one decider, and that was the president. So with no notice, the end of June of 2009, I get a call, and I'm told by the National Security Advisor at the time, Jim Jones, did anybody tell you that the president wants to see you tomorrow morning? And I said, what about? And he said, he'll tell you, which is another way of saying he wasn't. And so I have no clue what this is about. And when I go there the next morning, I'm ushered into the Oval Office, just the two of us, and he says, I need you to come over here. I said, to do what? He said, I need you to quarterback all the Middle East issues. And I said, well, what does that mean? And he said, look, all the issues, everybody here is sort of stovepipe. No one kind of gets how issues fit together. You do, you have to do it over here. And I, of course, I say, well, is the secretary okay with this? And what I'm about to say tells you all you need to know about President Obama. He says to me, just this way, he says, I've spoken to her and she's just fine.
So he sees his approach to national security with basically two goals, right? One is to stop the spread of nuclear arms.
Right.
And the other is to change the relationship between America and the Muslim world. You write that.
Yes.
But you write that he miscalculated how the latter would impact America's relationship with Israel.
Look, during the transition, I had been asked to write a memo because the president said during the campaign that he would reach out to Muslims. In the aftermath of the Bush administration, our image in the Muslim world was not good, and President Obama was determined to improve that. And so I was asked to write a memo during the transition before I decided where I was going, in which I was asked to say, where should he give the speech? And I explained that I thought it should be Egypt and not Indonesia. But I made the point at the time that if he goes to Cairo, he has to go to Israel afterwards, because if he doesn't go to Israel afterwards, the perception among Israelis is going to be that the outreach to Arabs and Muslims is going to come at Israel's expense. And unfortunately, he makes the decision not to go to Israel.
Right.
And it had that effect because in the speech in Cairo, he makes a real effort to reach out to the narrative, not just to reach out, but actually to identify with the narrative of Arabs and Muslims and Palestinians. And he makes a reference to Holocaust denial, which is an important thing, but he leaves the impression that the only reason Israel exists is because of the Holocaust, and not because there's a historic attachment to the land and there's a connection to the land.
Which the Arab world has always said, has advocated from day one.
That's right. And so, in fact, it really does erode any possible connection. And, he does go to Israel in March of 2013, and he gives a set of speeches that were very good in March of 2013. The problem is, because he didn't give them in June of 2009, he never created a connection with the Israeli public. And to this day, he doesn't have it.
You mentioned that you worked with Secretary of Clinton under this administration. Since she's running for president, I think a lot of people here would value your opinion on the following.
I know it gets you all choked up to talk about that.
How would a President Hillary Clinton administration differ or not differ from a President Obama administration in its relationship with Israel?
I think it would differ in two important respects. First, her instincts towards Israel are much closer to her husband's than they are to the president's. It's not that the president has a negative set of instincts about Israel. It's that the president basically feels we have a commitment to Israeli security, but he has always looked at the Israelis as being strong and the Palestinians as being weak. And because the Israelis are strong, the onus is entirely on them to act, and
So
not on the Palestinians.
not good and evil, right and wrong, but strong and weak.
That's right, exactly. And the onus is on Israel, not on the Palestinians.
Right.
It was a source of, when I would make these points within the administration, as long as I was there, President Obama is a very good listener, and he's a serious listener. And so, there were a lot of times I think that I could affect what was done, and I certainly tempered some of the policies, but the basic instinct was to treat the Palestinians as if they were too weak to criticize. Now, as I have often said, if they're too weak to criticize, they're too weak to be accountable. If they're too weak to be accountable, they're too weak to have a state. So you don't do the Palestinians a favor if you don't insist that they're accountable, because it's hard for them, given their own self-perception that they're weak and that they're a victim. And in a sense, if you make it easy for them never to be accountable, they never will be accountable. And unfortunately, that was one of the differences, I still have. But Secretary Clinton has a different mindset. It is, as I said, it's not just that it's closer to her husband's. I mean, one interesting indicator, she was in Israel when, after a few months of negotiation, the Prime Minister Netanyahu announced in November 2009 that Israel would do a 10-month moratorium, meaning for 10 months there would be no new settlement start, no new housing starts, not new settlements, no new housing starts. Now, those places where ground had been broken would be allowed to be completed, but there would be no new housing starts. So she got up next to him and said, "This is unprecedented." And when the Arabs didn't respond well to it, and the Palestinians said this is insignificant because they're allowed to finish what they're building. By the way, towards the end of the moratorium, what they were referring to as insignificant at the beginning, they were now calling indispensable later on. She said it was unprecedented. There was not an Arab embrace of this. There was Palestinian criticism of what she said. And then when there was criticism of her coming out of the White House, mostly anonymous, but it was, typically this is done. When you want to criticize somebody, you have these leaks. So, and I remember talking to her afterwards. I was over at the White House at this point, and I had defended her in this setting. But I talked to her afterwards, and, she said to me, "I said it because it was right." And, her basic instincts on this are different in that respect. And she's much more inclined to want to hold both sides accountable, not only one side accountable.
Well, that's quite a history lesson, isn't it? 12 presidents, 1, 2, 3. So yes. In what I found one of the most riveting chapters, I think it's the conclusion, or it's towards the conclusion of your book, you come to the realization that there are 3 or 4 assumptions,
yeah,
that every presidential administration has made vis-a-vis Israel, and every single one of these assumptions is wrong. Just, if you don't mind summarizing the 3, and because it's so vital.
They're interrelated, not surprisingly. One is that if you distance from Israel, you'll gain with the Arabs. There are 5 administrations that do that: Eisenhower, Nixon, Carter, Bush, and Obama, and not one does. 2 is if you cooperate with Israel, you'll lose with the Arabs. And I gave you the example earlier of the first arms sale to Israel, which is supposed to produce a collapse of our relations with the Arabs, and the Saudis don't even raise this. They're riveted instead on what they see as a threat within the region. And that is quite revealing, because for Arab leaders, their preoccupation is their security and their survival. And so because they see us as the guarantor ultimately of their survival, they're never going to make their relationship with us dependent on what we do with Israel. Israel isn't seen as a threat to them, but it's their regional rivals who are the threat to them. So it's Nasser in the 50s and 60s, it's Gaddafi and then Saddam Hussein in the 70s and 80s, it's Iran today. And that's what they're riveted on. Now, the third assumption is you can't transform our position in the region, and you can't transform the region unless you resolve the Palestinian issue. Now, you're looking at someone who spent the last 30 years trying to resolve the Palestinian issue. So it's not that I'm not committed to that, which I am today. I remain committed to it today, because I do think a two-state outcome is something that Israel needs. But I was never committed to it because this is going to change the region. It's going to transform our place in the region. Look at it today. It's not just as it's been true in the past. If tomorrow, the Moshiach arrives and and we have divine intervention and we have peace between Israelis and Palestinians, it's not going to stop one barrel bomb in Syria.
Right.
It's not going to roll back ISIS 1 meter. It's not going to change the struggle that President Sisi is having in Egypt with the radical Islamists. It's not going to end the proxy war in Yemen.
And the tragedy is, that's the right word, the Arab world has done very little for Palestinians when it could.
Right. There is a paradox, because I think historically there were periods when basically, at least up until 1974, from 1939 to 1974, there wasn't a Palestinian movement. There may have been a Palestinian identity, but the Arabs assumed a kind of responsibility, but they did nothing to resolve the conflict. Since 74, the Palestinians have been, in a sense, given the responsibility to solve their own conflict. In a strange way, because the weakness and dysfunction of the Palestinians today, we probably have to change the paradigm. We do need the Arabs to assume a responsibility for the Palestinians, at least in terms of making concessions, because the Palestinians can't make concessions without someone else assuming responsibility for it.
So we talked about the presidents, we talked about some of your conclusions. I want to turn to the third area, and that's some recent events. And I have to ask you about Paris. Clearly, the attack was not only on Paris, but it's an attack on Western values. ISIS put out a video on Monday saying something like, "We have struck at the heart of France in Paris. We will strike at the heart of the United States in Washington." What do you think the United States should do?
First is to figure out how come we were surprised by this. Why is it that they could have carried this out? Look, think about what they did. In France, you had Charlie Hebdo last January. France was on a higher level of alert from January on. And yet, this was an operation where 6 sites were attacked with 3 cells. We're learning now that there were, instead of the 7 who were killed, there were at least 2 others. Now, those 2 may have also now have been killed, but at least 2 others. My guess is we're going to find over time there were more involved. And it should be a source of profound concern that this was the kind of attack that was probably planned in Syria. And then these guys came back. I think one of the problems you have when ISIS has an operational space, they're able to plan these kinds of attacks. And so I think our challenge first is to understand what are the holes in intelligence that permitted this to happen. Second, to close those gaps. I mean, it's very clear that the exchange of intelligence ironically, is not what it needs to be, and that can be corrected.
That,
Uh,
yeah.
I was going to say, there's a couple other things I would just say. I mean, I
Please.
think the Europeans are going to have to approach, I think, the issue of border security differently than they have. But I also think we're going to have to be force used more intensively against ISIS within Syria and Iraq, but particularly Syria, because Raqqa is where they're planning everything. So that, the more they have to be mindful of their own security, the less they're able to be attacking others.
Well, let's, if I can press you to be a little more specific, because that's both a strategy and just a partial response. Naftali Bennett wrote, he's Israel's Minister of Education and the Diaspora, and he wrote a piece in the paper today, an editorial where he talks about the Second Intifada in Israel, and basically said 130 Israelis had been murdered in March of 2002. Ultimately, 1,000 were murdered. And he said they came to the realization that the only way to stop this was by force, brutal force, and including boots on the ground, and that if we are unwilling to confront this now, that it will only grow. Do you agree with that? Would you tell an administration, whichever administration were in power now, that they should be more forceful, that they should attack? I mean, there has been a war declared. When you say you're going to attack a nation's capital, that's war. That's a statement of war. It seems to me, to some, that maybe we're just waiting, God forbid, for something to happen, and then strategizing how to respond. Is it not appropriate to be a little more aggressive and say, you know what, we have to stop this now?
Well, I think we do, but I think we also have to think about the day after. And what I mean by that is we haven't been particularly good when we put large number of forces on the ground in Arab countries. And so it isn't to say that we shouldn't do more. I think we have to change the rules of engagement. The rules of engagement have been very restrictive. What I mean by that is, up until recently, when we would carry out air operations, close to 3/4 of the planes would return without having dropped their ordnance, because we didn't have, we were concerned about the nature of the targets and whether or not what is called, I mean, it's an antiseptic term called collateral damage.
Sure.
We were too concerned about civilian casualties. Well, we should be concerned about civilian casualties, that's true, but it was so restrictive that basically the character and the frequency and the intensity of our air operations were actually quite limited as a result. So I think you have to be prepared to widen your target list and the rules of engagement, one. Two, you have to be prepared to put spotters on the ground, American spotters on the ground, so you can actually identify the targets and you can have a higher level of confidence that you're actually going to hit those targets without causing that collateral damage. Three, we have found that when we actually had our advisors embedded down to the battalion level, those battalions in Iraq performed quite well. When we weren't there, we saw what happened. So it doesn't, if we use the term boots on the ground, if boots on the ground mean 50,000 troops, as the president said, I agree with him, that's a mistake. But if boots on the ground, if you can't put any boots on the ground, that's also a mistake, because you're limiting too much what you can do. So I think we do have to be prepared to do more of this, put more advisors on the ground, and I think I would do something else. The president has authorized 50 special operations forces. There are a lot of discrete targets where you could be going in and out. You don't have to stay. It would be very disruptive of ISIS. It would have them, as I was saying before, what I was getting at is, when they have to be constantly preoccupied with their own security, it's very hard for them to be planning attacks against us. We have not put them in that position, and one of the ways to put them in that position is change the rules of engagement, put spotters on the ground, have some advisors there, but have some of our own special operations forces carry out what would be hit-and-run raids. So you're not putting large formations on the ground, you're not taking over the war, and in the process you actually will show a level of seriousness which I think may also then produce more Sunnis. One last point, when I say more Sunni partners, the Arab states who were part of this coalition have not carried out bombings. The most recent one, the Saudis were the most recent to carry out bombings, which was, I think, in September. The Emirates haven't carried out a bombing since March. And the reason is twofold. One, because they're focused more on Yemen, but the other is, in Syria, they don't want to look like they're part of an assault only against Sunnis. You know, our problem right now is we're going to intensify against Raqqa in Syria, which is ISIS. The Russians, even after Putin has declared they're going to seek revenge over the bombing of their aircraft, the fact is they're still bombing mostly non-ISIS targets, which means they're bombing the non-ISIS opposition, which is entirely Sunni. So we're bombing ISIS, which is Sunni. They're bombing the non-ISIS opposition, which is Sunni. They're in league with Assad and with Iran. We will look like we're in league with them as well. We will lose the Sunnis then. When I say you have to think about the day after, it's one thing to militarily set these guys back. Unless they're discredited, they don't go away. Now, we can't discredit them. We're not Muslims. We can't discredit them. Sunni Muslims can, because that's who they are. If we want to, in a sense, destroy their ability to appeal, we need Sunni Muslims who will take the lead in doing that. And if we don't, what I'm saying in the end is we have to have a broader approach to Syria as well that makes sense, and we don't have that yet.
Shouldn't NATO be involved here?
NATO
Strikes
could
me
be.
as exactly what they're
Yes,
shooting
of course. Well, look, you know, I would like us, I think we need to create a safe haven in Syria along the Turkish-Syrian border, a place where refugees can go, a place where a Syrian opposition could become more coherent. If you want a political process, you got to have an opposition that is coherent enough to negotiate something and to implement what they negotiate. We don't have that right now. And if you think about it, we have a lot of leverage to produce it. Nobody has more of a stake in stopping the refugee flow than the Europeans. I mean, it's creating real fissures within Europe.
Right.
So they would contribute, for sure, their air forces to a no-fly zone. Turkey right now is discovering that this is a real problem for them. You know, maybe they didn't realize it soon enough, but they seem now to be more and more cognizant of this. Plus, they have 2.2 million Syrian refugees in Turkey. They need to stop this as well. They could put forces on the ground to police the safe haven. The Saudis, the Emiratis, the Qataris, they could finance the infrastructure for the refugees. And all of them together, we could agree all the money has to go to one source, one address, so you stop the fragmentation of the opposition.
How would you characterize the current stabbings in Israel, people being run over by cars? I read a statistic that was so troubling to me. There was a poll done in Ramallah, on the West Bank, a Palestinian Center for Social Policy.
Right.
And apparently support for the stabbings in Israel is some 90% of Palestinians. So this is troubling at every level.
It is
How
troubling.
would you
at every level.
characterize what's going on there?
Well, I want you to think about the following. The stabbings represent the most intimate form of terror you can imagine.
Yeah.
When these stabbings, you know who you're stabbing. You look at what happened in Paris. You go in, you throw grenades, you open fire with an automatic weapon. It's almost an abstraction. This is not an abstraction. This is an intimate form of bloodletting, and it is pure and simple terror. I wish at the outset the administration had called it that. It did not. It talked about a cycle of violence.
Yes. That was Kerry.
We should have said this is terror. A lot of it is being incited by a false narrative about Israel is going to change the Oscar Mosque.
Yeah, Abu Mazen supported that publicly.
He did say, yes. He said they're trying to change the status quo on the Haram al-Sharif, the Temple Mount. What you're citing in the poll is also deeply troubling because
Right.
what it shows is how far gone we are in terms of peacemaking.
Exactly.
There is I have said, you know, since I started working on this, I think this is the lowest period. The Second Intifada was much worse in terms of the casualties. I mean, Israel lost 1,000 dead, the Palestinians lost 4,000 dead.
Right.
And, you know, you're looking at, these are, individualized acts. It's not the first and second intifada were organized. They had the leadership. There was affiliation. There were big demonstrations. You don't see any of that now.
Right.
This is individualized, mostly 15 to 25-year-olds, although the attack today was by a 37-year-old. But it reflects deep anger, deep frustration. By the way, the anger is towards their own leadership. There was a recent poll that showed 80% of the Palestinians believe the Palestinian Authority is corrupt. 66% want Abu Mazen to resign. And what you see then is a kind of the adoption of a posture that is, you have to become more extreme in the face of that, not less so. And it's feeding what is a very strong anti-normalization movement among Palestinians. And so there's anger at their own leadership, there's anger at the Arabs who are consumed with everything but them, and there's anger at the Israelis.
Let me turn to the last area in the last few minutes we have. By the way, I would say one thing, that the world could learn a lot vis-a-vis ISIS from the fact that they started out and they focused on hating Israel. That Israel, what's the miner's canary analogy, that miners go into a mine and there are noxious fumes, but they can't smell the noxious fumes, so they take a canary into the mine. They're very sensitive, and if the canary dies, it's a statement to get out of the mine. Well, the Jews, I've heard, call the moral miner's canary of the world. We're the first to be to suffer the consequences of evil regimes, but we're never the last. And it would behoove the world to realize that those who hate the Jews are not going to stop with the Jews. Let me turn to the last area just for a few minutes. Your life as a diplomat. I'm guessing when you were a student at UCLA and doing your PhD thesis on the Soviet Union, on the Soviets, that you probably didn't say to yourself, one day I want to be the lead negotiator for the United States, for the President of the United States, and try to make peace in the Middle East. So how did you get started, and how did you get there?
Actually, that is what I wanted to do when I was how I got started, it's interesting. I tell my own students this, that a lot of life is serendipity. I mean, you can do things that improve your chances, but sometimes it's just being in the right place at the right time. My first job in the Pentagon was almost accidental. I was here at UCLA. I was doing teaching at UCLA. I had fellowships for a couple more years here. And I was also a junior faculty for something called the National Security Education Seminar, which was held in Colorado Springs this summer, which was actually summer camp for national security types. And I was going back to plan.
Did you say summer camp for national security types?
I did.
That sounds really riveting. Can we all go to, where was that held, by the way?
Colorado Springs, Colorado College.
Okay.
The morning would be seminars on national security things, and then in the afternoon, we played volleyball, tennis, golf, basketball. It was, it was really tough stuff. So, but I went. This was 6 weeks into I went back to plan the summer curriculum, and I just was making the rounds just to discover sort of what were the possibilities in a new administration. I didn't expect anything at the time. I had written my first long academic article, and I got directed to see somebody once. I saw one person in an office called ISA in the Pentagon. He directed me to somebody else. He asked me what I was doing, and I was describing what I had just done, and he said, "Look, we don't have any positions here, but there's someone I know who does." He sent me down to see this guy who was a fourth-generation graduate of West Point. And he asked me what I was interested in. I described it. And I literally been talking for about 10 minutes. He said, "You're exactly what we need around here."
Wow.
I turned around wondering who had walked in. But that's what happened. And then, one thing led to another. Something that's quite ironic. Paul Wolfowitz developed a name in the George W. Bush administration, but he was my first boss. It turned out he was my first boss in the Pentagon in the Carter administration. He was a political appointee. in the Carter administration. And so, he became, in the Reagan administration, he became the head of the policy planning staff in the State Department. He asked me to come over to leave the Pentagon. Now, I had spent 2 years working for McGovern, so the Reagan White House wouldn't clear me. I was not political. I didn't pass the political litmus test, and so I went on a rotation over there. And at that point, I began, among other things, to work on the autonomy talks. Generally what happened was I was writing a number of things. I got recognized. The circles, it seems like a very big government, but on a select set of issues, you can get recognized fairly quickly. And I did get recognized fairly quickly. And when I left to come back to Berkeley for a couple of years because I was sort of frustrated with what had happened during the Lebanon War, I was asked to come back to the White House, and I made the decision to leave Berkeley because I was being appointed the senior Middle East person, and I was the first person who was Jewish to ever hold that job. And I felt it was like a threshold crosser at the time, because when I first was working in the Pentagon on Middle East issues, and I recount some of this in the Carter chapter, the idea that you could be Jewish and work on the Middle East was seen as a contradiction in terms. If you were Jewish, by definition, you were biased. It was okay if you had a missionary background, or you came out of the oil companies, or you had an Arabic-sounding name, then you were an expert. But if you were Jewish, you were biased. Right. So for me to be appointed, and this is the Reagan administration, for me to be appointed as the senior Middle East guy at the White House who was Jewish, it was in a sense, it was establishing a precedent.
You teach diplomacy at Georgetown.
Yeah.
Distinguished professor. What are some of the traits that what do you say to your students are the traits that they should develop in order to be a good negotiator?
Well, the single most important attribute as a negotiator that is literally more important than anything else is to be a good listener. I call it being an active listener. You can't look like you're plumbing for information, but you have to show a level of curiosity to try to understand, why does someone hold the position they have? What lies behind it? What gives? Why is something so important? You learn when you're listening. I'm talking right now, but you learn when you're listening, not when you're talking. And so the most important attribute is to be a good listener. And the second most important attribute is the capacity to be able to capture what the other side needs in a way that shows you understand them, so that you can also say, look, for you to get that, this is what I need. Negotiations ultimately are about manipulations. You're trying to convince the other side that your red line is red and theirs is pink. And ultimately, you can do that when you get to a crunch point. You have to build a level of trust. The other thing is, you never promise something that you don't deliver, and you always deliver what you promise. So that you reach a point where when you say, I can do X, but I can't do Y, the other side believes you. And so, negotiations are about building relationships, but it doesn't mean that, in the course of building a relationship, you're not sacrificing your interests, but ultimately it's how you'll achieve your interests. I'll make one last observation. One of the things I tell my students, you'd be amazed how often sides go into negotiations not fully appreciating what they can live with. I mean, it seems counterintuitive, but you really have to be clear on what you need going into a negotiation. Too often, it's kind of very fuzzy. You think you need something, and you define it one way, and because you're not clear enough on it, you'll end up going beyond what you thought you could live with or couldn't live with.
I asked you so many serious questions. Let me give you a lighter one. Just let me think of it. So you negotiate about some of the most important issues in the world. Do you use those same negotiating tactics like when you're buying a car or something like that? Seriously, in your day-to-day actions with people?
Look, yes. Well, the short answer is absolutely. No, my proudest moment actually is I keep getting from my students, one said, yeah, I used a technique and I did really well in a car. And so I get these kind of little notes from them all the time. The idea is if you're going to be a good negotiator, you're not provocative for its own sake. Right? That's when you do that, you drive the other side into a defensive position. You never want to drive who you're dealing with into a defensive position because then they become even less capable of doing anything. So that's why I said you build relationships. And I thought you were going to ask something different. I thought you were going to say, do you use these negotiating techniques at home?
And your daughter is here, right?
Yes.
So we can check. One of your daughters is here.
No, but I mean, if Lonnie's here, what she would say is, she knows that actually, yes, at home, when it comes to my wife, I simply engage in preemptive surrender.
Let me ask you one last question, final question. There's so much more I'd love to ask you. In 2006, Alan Dershowitz wrote a book called What Does Israel Mean to Me? And there were some 80 different people who wrote 2 or 3 page essays on what Israel meant to them. If you were to have written such an essay, Ambassador, what does Israel mean to you?
Israel to me is sort of the soul of the Jewish people. We all do well here because we know there's an Israel. The Jewish people needed self-determination. They needed a state. And we all are better off because of it. People have often asked me, how can you be Jewish and be a negotiator for peace? And I answer that by saying, you mean to be Jewish, you don't believe in peace? I mean, a road of shalom, a seeker of peace, there are few higher callings. So for me, Israel is kind of not just a soul, but it's kind of the flowering of the Jewish people. And in a lot of ways, whatever its problems, and it has many, what is stunning about Israel is that with all the threats that it has faced, it has retained its democratic character. It is criticized by many because it is occupying Palestinians, and it's legitimate to raise questions about that. There's no such thing as a benign occupation. But it is interesting, Palestinians don't think about going to their own courts, but they don't hesitate going to Israeli courts. And it is pretty remarkable to face a set of threats and somehow preserve a rule of law and civil liberties. We know the tension that exists there. I just would conclude with one broad thought. One of the reasons the title of this book is called Doomed to Succeed, not Doomed to Succeed ? Is partly because of what you were saying about the canary in the coal mine, but it's also because we have shared values with Israel, we shared interests with Israel, we shared threats with Israel, and Israel has sustained itself as a democracy, the only democracy in the Middle East. And that contrast with the rest of the region will become more stark over the next 10 to 20 years because there's a struggle over identity which explains why the violence is so terrible in the Middle East, because nothing is more basic than identity. And Israel has its own struggles, and they're not simple, but it has a rule of law, it has a separation of powers, it has an independent judiciary. It's the only country in the region that has regularly and unregularly scheduled elections, where the loser accepts the outcome. It's women's rights are respected, gay rights are respected. I mean, ultimately, that's why the relationship is doomed to succeed.
And it's ours, which is not irrelevant. I want to simply say this. When you and I exchanged emails back in April or so, and we invited Ambassador Ross to be with us tonight, I don't think we could have ever anticipated the attention that your book was going to receive and the schedule that ultimately enveloped your life. You know, there are many reasons to be proud of Stephen Weiss Temple. One of them is the people of the stature and the depth of a Dennis Ross come here and spend their evenings with us and enlighten us about things that we care about, because Ambassador Ross doesn't just write about history, he helps shape history. Please join me in thanking Ambassador Dennis Ross.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.